This is the castle that Shakespeare used as a location in his play Hamlet to cause one of his characters to express the immortal words, "There is something rotten in the state of Denmark."
If there is something rotten in Europe, it is not to be found in Denmark. The Danes are the best housed people on the continent, enjoying the highest incomes and the lowest levels of corruption.
Well, I buy a virgin, that's what I always hear when you sigh.
Today, Denmark is rated as the happiest nation on earth. What happened to turn a country that was poor in natural resources into one of the most productive in the world? It's the untold story of a revolution, Danish style.
When they love, that's the kind of magic music we make with our lips when we kiss. Tak skal du have.
Three things happened in the 19th century to turn one of the poorest nations in Europe into one of the most prosperous, starting with the arrival of this king, Frederick VI.
In Shakespeare's day, Denmark was afflicted by corruption. By the 18th century, most of the peasants were landless serfs tied to the estates of great landlords. Frederick abolished hereditary servitude, and in the 19th century a new class of smallholders emerged. They numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The outcome was high-tech farming with room for smallholders, and an urban sector serviced by some of the best infrastructure in the world. But this outcome was not possible without a fiscal revolution. The seeds were planted by one of the king's advisors. Count Christian Reventlow recommended that a tax, known as the Hartkorn tax, should be paid by the owners of manor houses. Eventually, the Hartkorn tax collected more than half of the total rent of land. The third intervention that completed the revolution came from the pen of a poet and priest, Severin Grundtvig.
This man, Grundtvig, gave the idea for the Danish folk high schools, and he is a famous person in Danish history. The idea to the folk high schools he developed in some papers from the 1830s. And there's one important European date you have to remember, namely 1789, the French Revolution. And that inspired Grundtvig to say, if democracy, the rule of the people, should arrive in Denmark, he was a bit afraid of it, he said, then you couldn't let everybody, all the poor farmers and peasants, just vote. Democracy, all the political questions are not for children. Then you shall have a school for young adults. Today, you have to be 18 to attend a folk high school. And that's because then you are grown up, and now you have to learn about your society, your country's history and literature, to be an educated person, to someday participate in your country's political life. And then after a few years, in 1848, the king said, okay, let's have democracy. And Denmark had its first democratic constitution in 1849. And that gave an enormous impetus to create the folk high schools. And during the next 20 to 30 years, there was perhaps 50, 60, 80 folk high schools, just as we have them today. But of course, that was only one thing, because during the same decades as democracy was introduced in Denmark, there was the great industrialization wave and urbanization. There was so many young people from the countryside who left to go to Copenhagen, and others to modernize Danish agriculture. And that's a famous history in Denmark, because then we began producing butter and bacon to sell to England, to the new middle class in England, and therefore we have to introduce machines and modern methods in agriculture. And the folk high schools were the ideal places to introduce modernity in agriculture.
Everything seemed to be going well for Denmark, but in 1903 the government abolished the hardcore tax. It favoured the large landed estates. The government introduced new taxes on wages, and the property tax discriminated against the small farmers. But thanks to the folk high schools, the Danes were highly educated, politically astute, and they enjoyed the power of social solidarity. They fought back.
That was very important in the folk high schools, to learn we are Danish. The Danish people has a special role in history, and the Danish people has a responsibility to take over what former generations have left us and to pass it further on to our children and children's children. Another important figure in the Danish history, and especially in the history connected to the farmers and peasants, and therefore to the folk high schools too, George the American, because it was between farmers and peasants. They discussed organizational forms, economics, the relation to the state, and there were a group of folk high school people, teachers especially, interested in the ideas about this economic organizational models. The leading party, political party, the Liberal Party, they rejected these ideas. They were self-owners and they wanted to gain money on the land. But there was this idealistic trend in the history, and many of the folk high school people were idealists. They thought that there was a better way to do it.
Jacob Lange, a teacher in the folk schools, introduced Henry George's proposal for tax reform to his students. A political party, the Radical Liberals, demanded the regular revaluation of land for tax purposes. The Justice Party won seats in Parliament in the 1920s and demanded a major shift in the tax base to pay for public services out of the location rents. By 1922, Denmark was levying a direct charge on the rents of land. By the 1960s, Viggo Starkey, the leader of the Justice Party, was able to chronicle a golden age. One municipality was able to cut the municipal income tax because half of its expenses were covered by revenue from the rents of land. New infrastructure, like this metro, are now funded after the rents of their locations. Today, computers are used to help the tax authorities to revalue land every 2 years in Denmark. Per Møller Andersen is one of Denmark's champions of rent as the public's revenue. From his lakeside home, he campaigns for reductions in income and consumption taxes so that more revenue can be raised directly from land rents.
If you go to the tax authority's homepage, you can find the assessed values of all properties in Denmark. Here you see the property value, and that includes the value of the building and the land. And this is 2.75 million Danish kroner. And I pay a property tax of approximately 20,000 kroner, which is approximately 2,000 British pounds. And here you have the land value, which is 1.201 million kroner, and I pay a land value tax of approximately 20,000 kroner, equal to 2,000 British pounds. Unlike other countries where they do have urban sprawl, we do not have urban sprawl in Denmark, and the reason for that is the relatively high land tax we have. In Copenhagen, for example, they pay 3.4% of the land value in land tax, and that's the maximum allowed by government. And this causes developers to utilize the land when they've got it. The difference between the tax on the house and the tax on the land is that the land value is not created by yourself, whereas the value of the house is created by your own labor. One reason why we should increase the tax on the land values and reduce the tax on income is that in Denmark people move from the outer areas to the centers, Copenhagen, Kolding, etc. And because the productivity in the outer areas is much smaller, but they have to pay the same income tax. If they earn 100 kroner out there, they pay the same amount as they do in Copenhagen. So if you change the taxes to a land tax, they would pay no taxes out there because the land values are so low. So that would cause more people to move out there. And today people support the outer areas with a lot of money, doing a lot of things to try to develop these areas. And the easy way was just to introduce the land tax, because then people would voluntarily move out there and start working.
Very little in terms of the grand total of government revenue is raised directly from a charge on the rents of land. But that's not the point. It's the legacy of what happened in the 19th century when land was redistributed to the peasants, and in the early 20th century when a charge was imposed directly on land, its rents, and raised a significant proportion of government revenue. That helped to foster a social solidarity that's unique in Europe. The rest of the European Union need to understand that history. Those countries are divided by a legacy of dispossession from the land and the exploitation of people in the factories, which has created the class warfare of the 19th century and the divisions that led to bloody conflicts in the 20th century. Today, the European Union needs to learn the lesson of how to create a multicultural society where respect for people's differences of religious beliefs can be and can actually enhance community relations, where the community can learn how to coexist to the point of prosperity for everyone. And that's achieved by eliminating bad taxes on people's earnings and their returns on their investments, which actually distort the economy, cause unemployment, cause house prices to boom and bust, and raise revenue instead from the socially created rents of land. That's the way to social harmony. That's the history of Denmark. And if the European Union would learn that lesson, it would begin to solve the problems of Europe in the 21st century.
But they see river and the rock will show love will see anymore. We can go unknown. Blue skies up above, everyone's in love. Up that lazy river, how happy we can be. Up the lazy river. I try. and not to give in. I said to myself that suffer never will go so well. But why should I try to resist? And darling, I know so well that I'm done with you.